In 1847, San Francisco did not exist. There was a small Mexican fishing village on that peninsula called Yerba Buena, with fewer than 200 buildings and no particular reason to grow. A year and a half later, it was the most important port in the Western Hemisphere. I used AI to show you how that happened, so let's get started. Before Yerba Buena existed, before any town existed on that peninsula, the Spanish came and built two things, a fort and a church. In 1776, the same year the American colonies were declaring independence on the other side of the continent, a Spanish military expedition, led by Lieutenant José Joaquín Moraga, arrived at the tip of the San Francisco Peninsula and established a presidio, a military garrison, to defend Spain's claim to the Pacific coast. A few days later, a Franciscan priest named Father Francisco Palou founded Mission San Francisco de Asís nearby. The mission would eventually become known as Mission Dolores, named after a small creek beside it. Those two structures, a fort and a chapel, were the entire European footprint on that peninsula for decades. The Spanish were not trying to build a city. They were trying to hold a coastline. The presidio was a strategic claim more than a functioning installation, perpetually understaffed, underfunded, and by most accounts barely operational. The mission operated differently. Mission Dolores drew in the indigenous Ohlone people of the surrounding region, converting them to Catholicism and putting them to work farming, building, and maintaining the mission's operations. The Ohlone population in the region had numbered in the tens of thousands before Spanish contact. Disease, displacement, and the conditions of mission life decimated the indigenous Ohlone population over the following decades. The missions were secularized between 1833 and 1836, their land redistributed as private ranchos. The Franciscan missionaries left, and the indigenous workers who had sustained them were abandoned. The land passed to a relatively small number of California families who built a rancho economy on top of what the missions had left behind. The town of Yerba Buena, that grew up near the old presidio in the 1830s, was in many ways a product of what the mission system had created and then abandoned. The settlement that would eventually become San Francisco was called Yerba Buena. Yerba Buena sat on the shore of a bay that was genuinely one of the finest natural harbors in the Pacific. The bay could shelter entire fleets. It was deep, protected from Pacific storms, and connected to the interior valleys through a gap in the coastal mountains. Ships knew this. Traders knew this. The commercial traffic through the bay, mostly hide-and-tallow ships working the California coast, made Yerba Buena a practical stopping point. But practical stopping points are not the same as thriving towns. In the mid-1830s, the actual town barely existed. A few adobe buildings clustered near a cove at the northern edge of the peninsula. A small pier, a handful of merchants, traders, and former sailors who had jumped ship and decided the California coast suited them better than wherever they had been going. The Mexican government granted the settlement pueblo status in 1835, with Francisco de Haro as its first alcalde, governing a population in the low hundreds. Jacob Lease, an American merchant, built one of the first permanent wooden houses in Yerba Buena in 1836. What the town had, beyond its harbor, was a community of foreign-born residents who had come for trade and stayed. Americans, British merchants, a few Swiss and French traders, they converted to Catholicism as Mexican law required for land ownership and became, on paper, Mexican citizens. The most prominent of them was William Richardson, a British sailor-turned-trader who had arrived in 1822 and eventually established himself as a central figure in the hide-and-tallow trade operating out of the bay. His tent-framed structure built in 1835 was among the first in what would become the town proper. The Hudson's Bay Company opened a trading post in Yerba Buena in 1841. That same year, the first American overland emigrant party reached California. They had come for farming land in the interior valleys, not for the coastal settlement, but their arrival was a signal the Mexican government noticed. Americans were finding their way to California, and Mexico had limited capacity to regulate who came or what they intended once they arrived. By 1845, Yerba Buena had somewhere between 150 and 200 permanent residents. There was a store, a billiard saloon, a couple of boarding houses, and a general sense that the place was growing. slowly, fitfully, without any particular direction. The American consul in Monterey, Thomas Larkin, had been sending dispatches to Washington for years, noting that California was essentially ungoverned, and any American effort to acquire it would face minimal resistance. To understand what Yerba Buena actually was in those years, you have to understand the hide-and-tallow trade, because that trade was essentially the entire economy of Mexican California. The ranchos that had replaced the missions ran enormous cattle operations across the coastal valleys. The cattle were not primarily raised for beef. They were raised for their hides, which were dried, cured, and loaded onto ships bound for the leather factories of New England, and for their tallow, rendered fat that was sold for candle and soap production in markets across the Pacific. The hides were known in the trade as California banknotes. It was not an exaggeration. They were the currency the entire regional economy ran on. Yerba Buena's Cove was one of the key loading points for this trade. Ships from Boston and New York would work their way up and down the California coast, stopping at each rancho and mission settlement to collect hides, accumulating enough cargo to justify the voyage home. Richard Henry Dana described the hide trade in his 1840 memoir, 2 Years Before the Mast, one of the first accounts most Americans ever read about California. The trade created a class of middlemen based in Yerba Buena who handled the logistics of loading and storing hides before they went onto ships. William Richardson was the most successful of them. Nathan Spear ran a general store supplying both ships and rancho families. These men were not wealthy by Eastern standards, but they were essential, and accumulating land and influence in a territory Washington was increasingly eyeing. The hide trade was already slowing by the mid-1840s. Overgrazing had thinned the cattle herds. The ranchos were taking on debt. The economy that had sustained Yerba Buena for 2 decades was running out of momentum, and the town had not yet found what was going to replace it. It was about to find out. The Mexican-American War began formally in May 1846, but the action that mattered for California started before the official declaration reached the Pacific coast. In June 1846, American settlers seized Sonoma and declared the short-lived Bear Flag Republic. It lasted 25 days. On July 7, 1846, Commodore John D. Sloat of the U.S. Navy raised the American flag over the Customs House at Monterey and declared California annexed to the United States. 2 days later, Captain John B. Montgomery of the USS Portsmouth, which had been sitting in the bay for weeks, watching the Bear Flag drama unfold from anchor, received Sloat's orders and landed 70 men at Yerba Buena shortly before 8 in the morning. Montgomery read the proclamation at the Customs House and raised the American flag to a 21-gun salute from the ships in the harbor. The town's residents watched this happen. There was no battle, no shots fired, no resistance offered. The Mexican administrator had no troops to call on and no realistic path to defending the settlement. Revere read a proclamation from Commodore Sloat. A few residents came out to observe, and California changed hands on a Tuesday afternoon, while most of the town presumably went back to whatever it had been doing. The actual fighting was concentrated further south. Yerba Buena was a backwater. Its value was the harbor, and the harbor was now American. American military governance settled over California with all the awkward improvisation you would expect from an administration that had acquired a territory before figuring out what to do with it. The formal end of the war and the official transfer of California from Mexico to the United States under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did not come until February 1848. On January 30th, 1847, the military governor of the Northern District of California, Lieutenant Washington Bartlett, issued an order renaming Yerba Buena to San Francisco. The reasoning was stated plainly. Confusion had arisen because the bay itself was already widely called San Francisco Bay, and the discrepancy between the bay's name and the town's name was causing mix-ups in shipping and commercial correspondence. The name change was, in its official framing, a clerical fix. That is technically true, and also somewhat misleading. Renaming the town San Francisco was a deliberate act of territorial consolidation. The Spanish name was replaced with the one already on English-language maps and American trade correspondence. The town was being fitted into an American framework before that framework was even officially established. Under its new name, the town began to take on a different character. Samuel Brannan, a Mormon leader and entrepreneur who had brought a shipload of settlers around Cape Horn in 1846, was already operating a store and a newspaper. The California Star, the first newspaper published in San Francisco, began printing in January 1847. A survey was conducted by a civil engineer named Jasper O'Farrell, who laid out a street grid for the settlement. O'Farrell's grid was a practical document and an optimistic one. It assumed a much larger town than existed at the time. The streets were drawn to accommodate growth that had not yet happened and showed no particular sign of being imminent. The grid sat on the map as a kind of speculation. By the beginning of 1848, San Francisco had perhaps 800 to 1,000 residents, a post office, a school, a jail, a couple of hotels, and about 200 buildings ranging from solid adobes to rough timber frame structures to canvas tents. It was a real town by most practical measures, growing steadily, if not dramatically. Nothing about it suggested what was coming. On January 24, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall was working on a sawmill at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, about 180 kilometers northeast of San Francisco in the Sierra Nevada foothills. He was inspecting the mill race, a channel cut to direct water flow, when he noticed something in the gravel at the bottom. Small, irregular pieces of yellowish metal, heavier than they looked, that did not tarnish when he tested them. He brought them to his employer, John Sutter, who tried and failed to keep it quiet. The news moved through California cautiously at first. Samuel Brannan walked through the streets of San Francisco in May 1848, holding a glass vial of gold dust and shouting,
"Gold had been found at Sutter's Mill!"
This was partly genuine excitement, and almost certainly also a business calculation. Brannan had already stocked his store near the mill with every piece of mining equipment he could acquire. San Francisco emptied almost overnight. Merchants locked their shops, sailors abandoned their ships in the harbor, leaving them sitting at anchor with no crew. The alcalde wrote to the governor that the town was deserted, that businesses had closed, that there were not enough men left to form a jury. The population that had taken years to reach 1,000 dropped to a fraction of itself in weeks. Then it came back, and it kept coming. By the end of 1848, word had reached the eastern United States, then Europe, then South America, Australia, and China. President James Polk confirmed the discovery in his address to Congress in December 1848, and the question of whether the news was real was settled. The following year, somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people made their way to California. San Francisco was the entry point for most of them arriving by sea. The town that had 800 residents in January 1848 had grown to 25,000 by the end of 1849. Ships arrived so fast that crews abandoned them for the goldfields the moment they docked. Dozens left to sit crewless in the bay, used as storage or left to sink. The street grid O'Farrell had drawn as an optimistic projection became, almost immediately, inadequate. The town the gold rush built was not the same place Revere had walked ashore into in 1846. It was louder, faster, vastly more chaotic, and staggeringly more profitable for anyone in a position to sell things to the people flooding through it. The mission settlement, the Mexican village, the renamed American outpost, all of it was now the foundation of something else entirely, being built over in real time. The little town of 200 buildings became one of the most important port cities in the Western Hemisphere in under 2 years, not because of planning or governance, but because of 24 flakes of gold in a mill race and the way news travels when people desperately want to believe it. If you enjoyed watching this, subscribe, give this video a like, and drop a comment. What place or moment in history do you want me to reconstruct next? Thanks for watching!
I suppose the good times always outweigh the bad.